Why conversations about gear are stupid but inherently necessary. You'll notice that I don't have a guest on this show. Also, we're off normal schedule. We normally publish guest appearances on Mondays and Wednesdays at 9 o'clock a.m. Pacific. But now, for this show, it's a solo appearance, adding to the pool of the podcast content. If you know who I am, this is the Redacted Culture Cast. I am your host. If you want to support this show, you can find our gear at redactedllc.com. We also have some more things in the works. One thing to be queued up on is the V2 Redacted shirt. No hints yet. So, the teaser question: why are gear conversations inherently stupid and necessary? Well, there's a long history, if you want to call it that, within the gun culture that focuses on debates over what gear is considered valid and what gear is good for the scenario. Or maybe you could reduce it to, in the pop culture reference, who is best girl, or what is the best loadout. So, in my time, I have passed through multiple phases of how we have thought about this subject. And one of them, and all of them, have had correlations between different communities. For example, in the ripe years of 2013, anyone who, let's just say, had military experience was sort of expected de facto to look down on airsofters. And now it's a completely different environment. In fact, we have people like Blue Jean Operator and Garand Thumb and Admin Results occasionally posting their W's, or whatever you want to call it, out there in the airsoft world. And why is that relevant? Well, we've seen a lot of bridges built between different communities or different cultures or subcultures within the broader section of gun culture, which in essence is a part of why this podcast started. But a necessary component, if for those of us who grew up in the 90s and the early 2000s will know what I'm talking about, has always been the conversation about gear. Almost everyone has heard, at least everyone in my, let's just see, my cohort, most of us are very familiar with the old classic 9mm versus 45 argument, as well as the AR versus AK rivalry, deathmatch as you want to call it. And these debates have trickled down in format to different loadouts. Maybe you'll have people arguing plate carrier versus chest rig, placard-based plate carrier versus mollied on equipment. You might see things like an Ops Core ballistic versus a Team Wendy ballistic, or a Surefire weapon-mounted light being compared to a mod light system. So these arguments, or these comparisons, have oftentimes become the staple of how this gun culture has survived on the internet. Enter famous listicles, right? Top 10 handguns for self-defense, or top 5 scar killers, which if you've seen that in Recoil, you know the story, or top lists of firearms or accessories or optics that kind of do a balance of trying to account for all the possible players while also meeting the SEO standards of the day. But conversations about gear and comparisons about gear, especially in the realm of what is best, is in one essence sort of benign, because you and I, or me and an interlocutor and I, can get into a long conversation about whether or not the height of the Unity Fast Riser is preferable to the height of the GBRS Hydro Mount, or we can get into a conversation, we can talk about height over bore. We can talk about what that's going to do to shooting at range. We can talk about maybe snag hazards. We have all these subjects that we can talk about between the two of them, right? Why would you buy a GBRS Hydra mount when you can buy a Unity Fast Riser? And I think it was HRF Concepts, don't quote me on that, who made the little diving board that you can attach to the Unity Tactical Fast Mount. So now you have, you can argue extended capability versus this, that, and the other. And at the end of the day, the problem with both of these conversations is that many of the issues presented would be solved by time in the field, or time on a competition stage, or time in environments. Training environments is a good one, where you can at least qualify that you're hitting your target and also try to root out any additional problems. So any gear conversation, let's just say iron sights versus red dots, you could kind of blaze through, pun intended, a lot of the problems that come with both systems by taking it to a USPSA stage. And you know that USPSA is going to, it'll already designate a red dot optic as a different division than a non-optic pistol. And there are people who shoot iron sights better than better or faster or more effectively or more efficiently or any sort of metric. You know that there are people who can outperform with a stock Glock. They can beat out somebody who's got a race gun with the red dots and the compensators and the giant mag wells and the big stick mags. So like, you know that there are people who can do it, but that's kind of not the point. Because if we are going to reduce all gear conversations into who is the more skilled person, then at that point, the gear debate becomes moot. It really doesn't serve a point if your end result is it's not the Indian, or it's not the arrow, it's the Indian, right? It's not the gear, it's the user. And if that were the ultimate case, if that were simply the fact that it doesn't matter what you use, it really matters who's using it. If that were the case, then why would we invent anything? These kind of spiraling, aimless conversations are what typically, or what can very quickly become the defining element of gear debate conversations. Should I put an LPVO on my gun, or should I put a red dot or should I put an EOTech with a magnifier on it? Well, are you using night vision? What kind of shooting are you doing? Are you trying to fit within a competition rule set? Are you trying to, what's your budget? Are you going to, are you looking at what's your environment? Are you trying to consider factors like, how are you going to hold on to the optics for a while? For example, if you buy an EXPS 3-1 or whatever it is now, you're probably going to hold on to that for the better part of a decade, right? But if you buy a Strike Eagle and you continue in the progression, and your intent is to use it as a starting optic, you will probably be able to sell that Strike Eagle again. And so now you're looking at a plethora of factors that have sometimes very little to do with the so-called performance of the item that really influence the question of which is better or which is best. And that becomes a problem, right? If you want to argue which is the better platform, the AR-15 or the AK-47, and you're not considering supply lines, and you're not considering scenario or the event in which it is being used. For example, to a hobbyist who is not fighting in a war and who has the fiscal capability to feed the gun, load out the gun, and shoot the gun, then the difference between an AR-15 and an AK-47 or whatever, an AKM, is not massive. For the for most people, the difference between not for most people, for the person of this scenario, if you are not building it for a specific competition, and you're not in a use case scenario of being military or something, you can really, and you live in America, even better, you can really take either platform with their pluses and minuses, and you can build it into what you want it, what you can build it into your loadout, so to speak, right? Or not right, but with enough time, money, practice, application, preference, whatever, you can really, the difference between an AR-15 and an AKM platform for an American, let's just say, responsible citizen is not massive. But if you start stepping into scenarios like civil wars, or you're starting to step into areas like Russian invasions, if you're starting to evaluate it within systems outside of a consumer or the gun culture within America, then you might start running into other factors. For example, it doesn't do a lot of good to have an AR-15 in an environment where you can't find ammunition for it. But we already knew that. And so the point of the first part of this presentation is why gear conversations are kind of stupid. One, you can solve the debate very quickly in most scenarios at the range, on the competition field, or in a training environment. Second, the second reason why they can be stupid is because it becomes extremely difficult, unless existing in a prior framework, to establish all of the various forms of context that inform one's decision. And very often, these kind of debates can very quickly degrade into what if scenarios, adding context as we go. And it's that adding context is often very hypothetical. Example being, should you buy an 11.5 or a 13.7 pin to 16 AR-15? Should your barrel be 11.5 inches with a brace, or should it be 13.7 pin to 16 with a stock? Which barrel is better? And then you can start with, what's your environment? I live in this state. I live in Minnesota. What's the furthest distance you're going to shoot? Probably about 300 yards, because of wood lines and farms and the kind of rolling-ish hills that are in the bogs. But there are some scenarios and situations where you might be having to engage out to, say, 400, 500 yards. You can find them. They're just not as common. Or do you live in Utah, where you need to be making a shot at 1,000 yards, or you might want to make a shot at 1,000 yards? Well, in this scenario, neither of them is going to be good, because 11.5 is probably not going to cut it, and 13.7 is also probably not going to cut it for having an effective round at 1,000 yards and blah, blah, blah. So you can say, instead of it being a percentage base of quality, which one fulfills it better, you can say both of them fall below the pass-fail line. But now let's go. So let's stick to the Minnesota environment, right? And now you're debating between an 11.5 and a 13.7 pin. Okay. Well, now this is where the conversation is going. And then somebody subjects to, well, what happens if the ATF bans braces? That is a concern for some people. Okay. Well, now we added more context, but it's still a hypothetical at this point. It's possible, maybe even probable, but it's not. It's still a hypothetical. Then you add another one. Well, what happens if, so we go, well, if the ATF is going to ban braces, it'll probably be better to choose a 13.7, because I'm not interested in, in this conversation, I'm not interested in running on the negative side of the law. It adds a risk without a reward, or something like that. Whatever your argument goes. So now you have this situation, but then the interlocutor would say, well, what happens if the ATF is abolished? And now you have a hypothetical, what happens if the ATF bans braces, followed by another hypothetical, what happens if, as a result of the backlash from the brace ban, the ATF is abolished? now you're dealing with a debate that's just completely going into the hypothetical world, and it's very difficult and almost, let's just say, it doesn't go anywhere. And this is a good example of, and this is an example of how I would say the concept of a pure gear debate within gun culture tends to fall apart, or is not, it can become very frustrating. But that's not the end of the story. Gun culture does have a camaraderie, let's just say, about the gear and the guns and the stuff and the doing things and the drip and the whatever you want to call it, right? So within gun culture, there is a, since it's about an item, let's say a firearm, which also bears more symbolism than it does, I think, anything else. Because I think if you want to use symbology, the rifle is the American icon of individual responsibility and commitment to their family, neighborhood, and community. In other words, if you take that away from them, you are taking away something that is inherently American. And the rifle, let's just call it, whether you call it the Kentucky rifle, that's how it kind of started, or it's one example of how it started, sorry, or you take away the AR-15, or you take away the Sears catalog concept of your grandfather growing up in a lower class family, but ordering a rifle from the Sears catalog, and by that method learns to hunt and feeds his family, and whatever story is, like industrialization is rolling through, or there are, or even the Wild West and the repeaters and the revolvers. But there is something about the American rifle that, to the American history, is the icon of individual responsibility chosen voluntarily to commit oneself to the preservation and well-being of their community and their immediate environment. So that is in many ways why Americans hold them so dearly, because it's more than a pragmatic piece of equipment. And so why are debates about gear necessary? Well, one of them goes like this. I'm going to steal a little bit from, I believe it's Jordan Peterson, who was talking about how his theory, or maybe it's not even his theory, the theory that if you believe in evolution, the concept of the imagination was so that we could imagine versions of ourselves and let those imaginary selves die so that we don't have to follow that path. Argument being, animals, or non-sentient in the same way that humans are sentient, beings are incapable of projecting into the future concepts of themselves. They are incapable of imagining themselves going forward. And I think, for better and for worse, we do this so naturally that in many ways we don't think about it. I am driving my car, I see a cliff, I imagine my car careening off the cliff so I don't drive over the cliff. The imaginary me crashes into the barricade and falls over the cliff and dies, but I don't, because I can imagine that happening, and I can see if I drive this way, that'll happen. And this is sort of the kind of the rote example of foresight. And this very same concept can be applied to gear, because as we look at gear in this culture, as we look at gear, whether it's plate carriers or night vision or suppressors or barrel lengths or calibers, or the stuff that we have and the stuff that we want to have and the stuff that we want other people to know that we have and the stuff that we have that we don't want other people to know that we have. Many of these things, if not all of these things, oftentimes have attached to them an imaginary self. I could imagine myself owning this handgun And if I were in the scenario where I had to defend myself, I would want to have one that's reliable, right? So I can imagine that an unreliable gun would not work. And this is where we tell stories to ourselves and to each other, right? If I were in a scenario where I had to defend my wife's life or my life or the life of a child or whatever scenario it is, because if I were in a scenario that if I were in a scenario where I had, maybe the opportunity isn't the right word, but if I were in a position where the choices that I made and the equipment that I had would determine the life and death of other people for the good, right? I had the opportunity to save a life or protect one. I would want something that does it well. I would want something that functions, it's reliable, that when I'm using the equipment, I'm not concerned about it. And so those are the stories that we tell ourselves, the imaginary selves that we create, these figments of our imagination that we create so that, and we pit them against each other so that we can hopefully solve so many of the sorting questions before we get to the table where we're buying something and using it. And so this is why you don't see debates, or you shouldn't see debates, maybe, between two unholy, WHOLEY, or LY, because it's not the other one, whatever spelling, this is why you typically don't see certain things compared to each other in gear debates. But, I digress, I guess. Do I want to buy a 22 revolver or a Glock 19? It's like, well, in most scenarios, that's not really a debate. They're very different tools. They're different tools. So why gear conversations are necessary is so that we can try to sort out as many pieces as we can out of the potential pool before it comes to brass tacks, money, and decisions. And it doesn't sound very fancy. It doesn't sound very fulfilling when you say it. But there is with very few exceptions, there's no way for us to test everything, or an individual to test everything, all available options within a list. They have to figure out how to narrow it down. Whether this is Crane over with the military, testing out military equipment, whether it's the individual using his own pocketbook as his financier, whether it's whether you're getting ready for competition, which you can use the expertise of others, whether it's whatever. In these scenarios, hunting and fishing, well, you don't fish with a gun most of the time. I think it's illegal in some areas. Wouldn't. In the words of my grandpappy, it ain't illegal if you don't get caught. But that you do you, boo. So in the necessary element of why we have debates about gear is that we have to get rid of as many options as we can, sort out as many options as we can until it comes to spending the money and the time and the resources and the risk necessary to test it out. If we can do that first, if we can eliminate as many of those problems as we can before we get out to the competition stage, before we get to the range, before we get to, let's just say, the battlefield or the scenario that we were discussing earlier, we will actually be better off. The debates within gun culture about gear over time do improve the culture, but sometimes it comes at the cost of the parts. Sometimes things, beloved, whatever it is, don't survive. Okay, fine. Sometimes trends come and go, right? I think there was a show. It was who was it? I think it was Jared of Orion Training Group, who said something like, in 2015, red anodized parts was all the rage. Yeah, I mean, I saw some of that, but I was also getting ready to shoot competition at the time, and a red anodized part is definitely more of a competition thing. It's much less of, say, a tactical thing. Whatever that means. Tactical, cool. Yeah. It's like 1990s marketing. Tactical. Yeah, whatever, dude. But the other thing that gear debates help, and where they help with, is they can be, when done respectfully, identifying their place within the ecosystem of this conversation as a whole. And that goes something like this. We have all heard the phrase mission dictates gear, which could be expanded onto mission dictates tactics, tactics dictate gear, or guide gear, or select gear is another way of saying it. So if you have a mission, let's just say your mission is to get from point A to point B, and that mission includes climbing a mountain, and you have to climb that mountain through snow and up rock and do some vertical climbing. So you're going to be carrying rope. That will suggest that if the goal is to get to the top of the mountain and you want to do it as quietly as possible, and you don't have a helicopter, because helicopters are not as quiet as you think they are, especially if you know what to listen for, but whatever, something Waco. But if you have to climb a mountain, you're probably not going to select sneakers. Probably. Now, there are exceptions to every scenario, and if you want to go down the road of playing I'm the exceptions guy, you do you, I'm bored. But you're probably going to pick something like Oscilla Fugitive GTXs, Solomon Quest, some sort of hiking boot that has ankle support and enough tread on the bottom and isn't so clunky that you can do a little bit of climbing if you have to, or is light enough weight, and you're gonna pick a series. You're gonna go through a series of choices, and then eventually end up probably with like 3 or 4 boot choices that you're going to kind of sort through, and they're going to be dictated by your environment, and you're going to whatever, right? So you've decided that you're going to climb a mountain. You got to get to the top of a mountain. That's the mission. The tactics are, well, it needs to be quiet. So you're going to hike, and you're going to hike your way up, because that's the easiest way to make the least amount of noise. And then that's going to tell you which kind of boots you're going to want to use. And then you can also select for maybe ones with a slightly different rubber complex. And you could beat this horse all the way to the grave and beyond if you wanted to. That's a weird metaphor, by the way. But not to beat the dead horse. Gosh, that's a weird metaphor. Americans are so strange. But if you wanted to, you could take this metaphor all the way down to helping you select gear, and it'll probably root out a pair of Vans. And there, can somebody do it in a pair of Vans? Probably. Are you that guy? That's a personal question. Because if you're not that guy, but you think you're that guy, you will break an ankle, and everyone will point fingers at you and say, ha, 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 he thought he was the guy, but he's not the guy. And that's how it goes. So, cool. But where it does go, where this question where this metaphor, this example does apply to gun culture, is mission dictates tactics, tactics dictate gear, or tactics select for gear. Now we have a problem, because for the citizen side of this question, setting a mission can be very difficult. Setting a mission itself is very difficult, because you do not have the jurisdiction, and there's a reason for this, and it's not just oppression or liberalism or libertarianism or whatever. You do not have the same jurisdiction to do what the Navy SEALs do. You do not have the sanction by the government, which is supposed to be selected by the people, which means the people sort of give sanction to the Navy SEAL, Delta Force, Operator, Ranger, blah, 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 blah. So you don't have that. You also don't really have a target. This is a case in point, in that we, for good reason, look very suspiciously at anyone who so-called builds a target package. It's kind of shady, dude. And if you know what that is, you know what it is, right? It's the same thing as like if you're spying on somebody and no one, and you know, if you're just for fun, we don't really respond to that well. Like, oh, you're just collecting data on me? Thanks, dude. No, it's not. It's not. There's something about it that's a little bit less than casual. So the mission for the citizens is different, and we know this, but it's different, necessarily different than the, let's just call it operator, right? The Navy SEAL. The mission for the civilian or the citizen is different than the operator. And we know this, like this is natural. We just know it. Making that argument any other way, it would be ridiculous. So theory would dictate that our equipment should be different. And there are many cases where it is. You don't see many SEAL snipers wearing real tree camo when they're out on the mission. But you do see citizens wearing real tree camo when they're hunting for meat for the winter, when they're going to go harvest protein for their diet. So that makes sense. And that helps identify part of the issue. Citizens and civilians are in a difficult place when it comes to determining what gear is necessary. And if they're going to simply select because it is owned by, used by, operated by Navy SEAL, we all know that you're going to run aground because you have different mission sets. But there is oftentimes the case, if you want to go back into the American spirit, of rugged individualism, if that's a thing, or being capable, simply being capable. There are many times where equipment used by your operators are the same kind of equipment that you would want to use or could want to use for your mission set. So we believe that there is no metaphysical separation between the special operations operator and the citizen of the United States. This is one of the things that it should mean to be an American. There is no metaphysical difference between the Delta operator, or whatever you want to call it, the Army Ranger, and the American citizen. There's no metaphysical difference, and there's no ethical divide between those two, which drives them into different, let's just call it, metaphorical subspecies. We are all created equally, and we know that some people have spent years, decades, and more. Well, it's hard to find years and decades honing certain skill sets. So they're going to be able to use a certain piece better. Maybe, yeah, I mean, they're going to be able to, whatever. So that's a derail. But they're going to be able to use a certain set of skills that they've built better than somebody who, say, has been doing it as a hobby occasionally. Their skill set, we're talking about skill sets and mission sets now, but we're supposed to be talking about gear. So we know that there's something wrong, or we know that it's not perfectly one-for-one practical for the average civilian citizen to simply style all the gear that they want to buy off of, let's just say, Navy SEAL, unless it's out of some sort of homage, right? If it was an homage, it makes sense. You know, I would like to have a full set of Navy SEAL kit circa 2003, because that year was the year this happened and it was really cool. And it's just something I look up to, and so forth, right? You know, and there is no one poo-pooing that. And if they are, like, fine, dude, whatever. There is no one poo-pooing that. And if they're, yeah, fine, dude, whatever. So the point being is that as we, as a gun culture, continue to invest in our gun culture and our communities and our environments and our populations and our neighborhoods. And as we continue to be what it means to be an American, or do what it means to be an American, which is invest at the lowest common denominator as much as possible and push that culture upwards, as opposed to have our culture dictated from the top down. As we continue to do that, we will be in a constant state of redefining what that mission set looks like. And we will we will be able to avoid, we will be required to and made able to avoid the pitfalls of chasing gear to try to define the mission. Okay, just because you own night vision doesn't mean that your mission set is to do night raids. If you swim up the wrong side of the stream, you're going to cause problems. Don't let your gear dictate the missions that you're going to do or what you're trying to provide, right? For example, being, if you can't keep food on the table, don't buy another AR-15 because you're much more likely to starve to death. Because even if the economy doesn't completely crash, if you're not willing to put food on the table, folks, this is the hyper complicated version of the loot box, loot drop joke. Is your fitness and your health is a much more important piece of your kit, so to speak, than anything that you own. Because if you can't get out of bed in the morning, it doesn't matter if you can shoot at 1,000 yards. And we all know this, and it doesn't need to be beat to death. And if you don't have a roof over your home because you're so fiscally incapable or fiscally irresponsible, what's the point of that firearm whatsoever? You're not trying to, we do not want to fantasize the so-called lack of responsibility necessary in a post-apocalyptic world for the sake of avoiding the responsibility that is right in front of us. So, gear. Why gear debates are necessary is because they force us to look up that stream and ask hard questions. What's the point? Why am I here? What am I doing? And then look for those answers. And those answers, more than the equipment itself, is typically how we judge each other. We typically make judgments for the better between each other based on what are we doing with our lives, our scenarios, what are we doing with each other, how are we building into our communities. And the gear debate is just the entrance into the conversation. So, with that being said, this is a surprise. It's a Friday episode that I decided to put together because the subject has been burning on my mind. If you would like to hear more, if you'd like to have more of these solo conversations, let me know. You can always comment on the YouTube pages. You can leave reviews on the podcast locations. There are ways you can communicate with me. If you are on Instagram and you wanted to send me a DM, I will probably get to it. I'll be able to get to the DMs that way. But these solo conversations are topic focused, not guest focused. And they are, this one being one driven from a subject that has been sort of percolating for a few days. And I'll probably only release them on Fridays if they come out at all. So if that's the case, let me know, and I will get back to you, and we will continue this process. That being the case, this is the Redacted Culture Cast. I thank you for your time. If you want to do the like, subscribe, social media things that you're supposed to do because everyone tells you to do it, not because you want to yourself, because that would be weird, you can do that. I am your host. Nah, it's not, Mom, can we have John Lovell? No, we have John Lovell at home. There you go. This is the Redacted Culture Cast. You can support us at redactedllc.com, and I will talk to you later. Thank you very much, and goodbye.